Order. I will call Edward Morello to move the motion, and I will then call the Minister to respond. I remind other members that they may only make a speech with prior permission from the member in charge of the debate and the Minister. There will not be an opportunity for the member in charge to wind up, as is the convention for a 30-minute debate. Order, order. Edward Morello to move the motion.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Vaz, and it's an honour to serve under your chairship. And while I confess it is tempting to use this 30 minutes to talk about the disastrous result of the weekend, I will instead remain to the topic, stick to the topic, and beg to move that this House has considered government support for English rugby. I am a rugby romantic, Mrs. Vaz. For me, and for so many others, the game is about something far deeper than the scoreline. It is, of course, about solo tries and rolling mauls and high-pressure drop goals that win World Cups. But it's also about the burgers from the clubhouse kitchen. It's standing in the sidelines in the rain, snow, wind, and very occasionally on glorious sunshine. It's the professional players having their signed shirts on the walls of their childhood club. It's tying the laces of my son's boots on a Sunday morning when he turns out for the under-7s. It reminds me that rugby is not just a sport, it is a community. And at the heart of that community is grassroots rugby. Local clubs are far more than places where games are played. They are community assets. They are where children, parents, supporters, coaches and volunteers come together. Yes, we go there to play and watch rugby, but they are also where fitness classes are held, community events, social gatherings. They're places where friendships are made and where people feel part of something bigger than themselves.
Will he give way?
Of course I will.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way and congratulate him on this important debate. I am, of course, the Member of Parliament who represents the home of English rugby, and I also have the Premiership team Harlequins in my constituency. But we also have grassroots clubs like Temesians and others who are struggling for pitch space, particularly for their women's team, who are doing a brilliant job, actually. Does he agree with me we should be doing everything we can, given what he's just said, to improve access to playing field space, and therefore will he join me in imploring the Minister talk to his colleagues in MHCLG about their plans to remove Sports England as a statutory consultee on planning applications, which could reduce the number of pitches?
I thank my honourable friend for her intervention and agree with her wholeheartedly, and I'm sure the Minister will take the opportunity to speak to that pledge. Most importantly, grassroots clubs are where the future of the sport begins. It's where the next England star first learnt to pass, make a tackle and score a try. And yet many grassroots clubs are struggling. Across the country there are clubhouses that are outdated, that have unsuitable changing rooms, where facilities are not always appropriate for the women's game. Often there are no women's changing rooms at all.
Will you give way on that?
Of course I will.
Thank my honourable friend for giving way. I founded North Dorset Women's Rugby Club back in 1995. I'm very pleased to say it's still going. They also have a fantastic girls team now linked with Castle Carey Rugby Club in my constituency for girls aged between 12 and 18. There's been some great work on facilities, and there's been some funding available through Impact 25 to help with changing facilities for women's and girls, but it needs to continue. It ends at the end of this month. So does he agree that we need that funding to ensure that there's that ability to include women and girls in our rugby clubs, particularly in rural areas?
For her intervention, and I wholeheartedly agree. I will come on to the issues around funding, but also about how we measure what the impact is to make sure that where we are, whether it be RFU funding or government taxpayers' money through Sport England, that actually we are measuring the outputs and making sure that we're delivering results.
Can we give way, please?
I will give way.
Thank you very much. Okay. First of all, can I commend them for bringing this forward? And it's not just about the clubs, it's also about those who inspire. And one of those who perhaps could inspire as pop culture sensations, such as former English rugby gladiator Fury. We watch her on a Saturday night normally, encouraging young women to be strong and perhaps fierce. The time is now to encourage young boys and girls to get a love for the sport, and this can only be done with the, as he rightly says, with adequate funding. And indeed, would the member not further agree that the physical benefits of the sport are equalled by the mental health benefits as well, and the sense of camaraderie that exists in being part of a team at any level, and that is well worth funding across this United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Thank you, Honourable Member. I wholeheartedly agree with the sort of wider benefits, and I will speak to some of the important things that physical activity and sport brings to communities and to young people. However, it would be remiss of me allowing him to mention gladiators without mentioning my son's favourite gladiator, Nitro. I'm sure he'll be delighted to have that on the record. Financial pressures are constant. Many clubs survive only because of the extraordinary dedication of volunteers who give their time to keep the lights on and the pitches playable. Matches are regularly cancelled because clubs are unable to field a team in certain age groups. In the last 24 years, 174 amateur clubs have disappeared, and that should be a concern to all of us. Because if we want rugby to thrive in the future, grassroots clubs must be protected and supported. Of course.
Very grateful to him for giving way. He's making a very powerful speech about the power of rugby in our communities. As a proud Northerner, I am here to speak about League. The Rugby League Foundation, the Leeds Rhinos Foundation as well, do excellent work with local community clubs. They invest £1 and it generates a £7 return for every £1 they invest in community clubs. But the facilities are decaying and in some cases limit opportunities. Does he agree that the government should consider targeted facility support to ensure these clubs are successful on and off the pitch?
For his intervention, and my Lancastrian wife will be delighted that Rugby League was brought into this, as she always tries to convince me it's better than Union when I'm watching it, but I think absolutely I take his point, and I'm sure the Minister will too. The government's support has made a difference where it has been targeted effectively. Through arm's-length bodies such as Sports England, almost £14 million has been awarded to grassroots rugby through the legacy funding from the 2025 Women's Rugby World Cup. National Lottery funding has invested nearly £50 million in the women's and girls' game since 2009, with £11.8 million confirmed between 22 and 27. That investment has had positive results. We've seen that clearly in the growth of the women's game. The Red Roses have become one of the most dominant teams in world sport. They have won 3 Rugby World Cups, including the most recent tournament in 2025. They defeated Canada in front of a record crowd of over 41,000 spectators at Twickenham. They've won 20 Women's Six Nations, achieved 18 Grand Slams, and hold the record for the longest winning streak in international rugby with 33 consecutive victories.
Hear, hear.
The funding has also supported a 35% increase in age grade girls playing rugby since 22, and over 43,500 women and girls are now registered with the RFU. But despite this success, the women's professional game still faces major structural challenges. Many players in the Premiership women's rugby remain semi-professional. They train and compete at the highest level while also holding down second jobs. If we want the women's game to continue growing, we must ensure that facilities are appropriate, that funding is sustainable, and that players are able to become fully professional. The government can play a role here, not in controlling the sport, but in supporting its development. And the same is true at grassroots level. Across my constituency of West Dorset, we have extraordinary rugby clubs: Bridport, Dorchester, Puddletown and Sherburn. They represent everything that is good about community sport. But even as we celebrate their achievements, we must expand the game. Grassroots rugby needs more targeted government investment, particularly in the most deprived communities.
I will. Thank you very much for giving way. And I have Nottingham Rugby based in my constituency, based in what was formerly known as the Championship, now the Champ. And the reality is that funding for the Championship, the second tier of rugby, has reduced sharply in recent years. And my club is genuinely struggling to stay afloat. And he talked there about women being largely semi-professional rather than professional. And the truth is that's happening in the second tier of rugby as well. Does he agree with me that this raises genuine questions about the viability of rugby? And would he agree with me that it would be wise for ministers to genuinely look at how long the game can survive?
I thank the Honourable Member, and I absolutely agree. In fact, I would quite happily do a whole other Westminster Hall debate on how we get the Championship up, the Champ up, because actually the margin between the Prem and the Champ now is so enormous. And there are better models, and if we look at, France and the success of the I'm sure it's probably pronounced, it is markedly different than our second tier rugby in this country. Rugby must be a sport that is open to everyone, not just those who happen to attend traditional rugby playing schools. Where state schools have had the right funding and support, they have thrived in the schools competition. competition, fueled rugby academies, inspired a new generation of rugby fans, and shown what is possible with the right conditions. And the sport needs far greater diversity. It needs participation from people of all backgrounds and socio-economic circumstances. It's not just good for society, it's good for the sport, because a larger, more diverse player pool ensures that we have the best players and the strongest competition. That means that rugby must exist in more state schools across the country, and there's been a worrying decline in school sports provision. Data from Youth Sports Trust shows that the number of hours of PE and sports delivered in schools has fallen by more than 45,000 hours since 2012. This cannot be the direction of travel if we are serious about the health and well-being of our young people. The government has announced reforms such as the new School Sports Partnership and a national enrichment framework. Those are very welcome steps. But when will those programmes be implemented? Will they be in place for the next school year? And can the government guarantee that there will be no cuts to school sports funding? School sports need stable multi-year funding. Active children are more likely to remain active adults. It brings enormous public health benefits. The RFU has also begun important work to expand schools in sports. In 2024, it commissioned a review of rugby union in education, focusing on sustainability and participation. One of the most exciting initiatives is the rollout of T1 Rugby, a non-contact version of the game developed by World Rugby. In the 24-25 season, T1 Rugby reached 1,800 schools and around 80,000 students, with a near equal mix of boys and girls. Within 4 years, this programme aims to reach over 5,000 schools. It shows what can be achieved when organisations work together with a clear strategy. Government departments must do the same. Education policy and sports policy cannot exist in isolation. If the Department for Education and the Department for Culture, Media and Sport collaborate effectively, rugby can reach schools and communities that have never previously had access to the sport. That means providing equipment and time to have PE on the curriculum, proper time and training for teachers to have the confidence to coach, proper facilities to get changes and pitches to play on, the ability for all children to access boots and sports clothing so they're able to play. We must also recognise the role that rugby can play beyond the pitch. Sport is a powerful form of soft power. Just as football, music and creative industries project British culture across the world, so rugby can do the same. Players such as Maro Itoje, Ellie Kildunn, Henry Pollock, Sadia Kabea, Ellis Genge and Meg Jones are more than just elite athletes. They should also be ambassadors for this country. We should also recognise the serious financial challenges facing the professional game. Prem Rugby has grown in popularity. Attendance figures are rising. Stadiums are filling and broadcast audiences continue to increase. But despite those successes, financial sustainability at the top of the pyramid remains a real concern. Several Premiership clubs continue to carry significant losses. Collectively, clubs owe large sums in pandemic loans issued through the government support scheme. During COVID-19, the government provided £123.8 million in loans to Prem Rugby clubs. It was 57% of the total amount to sports organisations. Champ clubs received a combined £4.8 million in loan support. It was vital support that helped clubs survive the pandemic. But the financial model of professional rugby is fragile. Clubs like Wasps, London Irish, Worcester Warriors have entered insolvency in recent years, unable to pay back the huge amounts of debt owed to the taxpayer. Even among the surviving clubs in the Prem, there are significant financial losses. 2025 figures showed that the biggest annual losses of £7.5 million at Saracens and £7 million at Sale Sharks, but every Premiership club recorded a loss, highlighting the financial pressures facing the professional game, even as it works to stabilise after the disruption of recent years. The government has been very supportive through the loan system, and I hope we will hear a firm commitment from the Minister that this will continue. But it's not acceptable for top-flight rugby. I will.
Thank you for giving away a second time. And I just need to put on record, Nottingham Rugby took a £900,000 COVID-19 loan. Before the pandemic, it was receiving somewhere between £500,000 and £750,000 a year in a grant from the RFU. But that's now down at around £150,000. So that £900,000 COVID-19 loan just simply isn't payable. And so does he recognise that actually the COVID-19 loans now are a real problem for those smaller clubs, and actually they're becoming a burden that probably won't be payable?
Yeah, I mean, I think even with the renegotiation and the favourable terms that the government has provided, it's creating a long-lasting problem for both the Prem and the Championship clubs. I suspect that if 21% of Premiership football clubs had collapsed inside 18 months, there would be widespread calls for a national inquiry. Premiership rugby clubs collectively carry 300 million in debt and often rely on the generosity of wealthy owners to remain afloat. We must acknowledge that reality, but we should not respond with pessimism. Instead, we should focus on building a sustainable future. I welcome the roadmap the Prem has to become financially stable and ultimately self-sustaining. When that happens, the professional game will be able to support the wider rugby ecosystem, funding development pathways, supporting lower leagues and strengthening grassroots rugby. At the moment, as we've discussed, the gap between the Prem and the Champ is just too wide. Promotion and relegation have long been a romantic part of British sport. They represent the idea that any club with enough determination and talent can climb to the top. It adds jeopardy and excitement, and it's something I wholeheartedly support. But that system can only work if the financial foundations of sport are strong enough to support it. The last team to be relegated was Saracens in 2020. The last team to actually be successful after promotion was Exeter Chiefs. Investors must have confidence that clubs can remain viable whether they are in the Prem or in the Champ. Countries such as France have demonstrated that this is possible. If the current choice is having a professional rugby in England by ring-fencing the Prem, attracting investment and building for the future, or persist as we are and risk losing the professional game and clubs forever, because at the moment we do not have the investment, the viewership or the money to keep it afloat.
Will you give way on that one?
I will.
He's making a really important speech about the input that government can have and the Prem, but it's only been mentioned a couple of times around the role that the RFU has in the future of rugby. And we hear from the RFU so much about shaping support for the community game. However, it was the RFU that in 2020 savagely cut regional development officers and club relationships managers. Does the honourable gentleman agree with me that it's the RFU that should be putting this funding back to support the grassroots game?
You leave me in something of a quandary because I deliberately chose government support for English rugby rather than using it as an opportunity to beat up the RFU, which I certainly have my criticisms of them, and I will come on to some of the points. More broadly, I think that any organisation, government repeatedly says the RFU is an arm's length body, but the reality is the RFU is in receipt of millions of taxpayers' money, and therefore it is absolutely justifiable for parliamentarians to hold them to account. And my personal view is, right now, not enough money is getting to the lower parts of the rugby pyramid. Sorry, apologies, Chair. We will come back to that on another debate. Yes, there are signs of growth and optimism in Prem Rugby. The quality of rugby is amongst the best in the world. We are producing world-class talent, and which the Six Nations aside usually excels on the world stage. Attendance is growing, with several rounds of Prem Rugby seeing sold-out fixtures and stadium occupancy reaching record levels. Broadcast audiences are also increasing, with round 9 in January attracting over 1.2 million. The Premiership final last year, which is the Bath supporter I am legally obliged to mention, come on Bath, drew in nearly 1 million viewers in addition to a live crowd of 82,000 at Twickenham. And social engagement following the final had interactions across Premiership rugby channels rising by 24%. TV figures are up 35% since 2022. These figures show that when the game is accessible, exciting and well promoted, fans are eager to watch, attend and engage. The professional game also provides a platform to not only showcase elite rugby, but also inspire the next generation and increase participation. But we must translate this success into players that are playing at a grassroots level, something which I worry we are failing to do. Government does have a role in English rugby, not by running the sport, but by ensuring transparency, oversight and responsible use of public money. When taxpayer funding sports facilities, development programmes or COVID loans, Parliament has a duty to ensure that that money is used effectively. The government, through Sports England, has invested £72 million into rugby unions since 2016. Most recently, £16.9 million to the RFU across the 22-27 funding cycle. We have a right and a duty to make sure that public money is well spent in the right places and on the right things. Government can also actively take an interest in promoting and growing all parts of our game, from using our athletes as ambassadors for our country to directly supporting community rugby groups who reach out to those schools that we cannot reach. And that brings me back to local communities and grassroots, because without grassroots rugby, none of the rest exists. The volunteers who mark the pitches, cook the food, coach the children and wash the kit are the true foundation of the sport. They deserve our recognition, our support and most of all, our thanks. If we support grassroots rugby properly, if we bring the sport into more schools, if we invest in deprived communities, if we strengthen the women's game, if we stabilise the professional leagues, then we will have a game that we love and we can see flourish.
This House has considered government support for English rugby. Minister Ian Murray.
Thank you very much indeed, Mrs Vaz. Always a pleasure to see you in the chair. And apologies, the Sports Minister is at the Paralympics, the Winter Paralympics in Milan, so there's nobody more appropriate than a Scot to take this particular debate. And Mrs Vaz, if you'll indulge me, the reason I'm wearing this tie is purely because I left my other blue tie in the car this morning, and this is the only one that hangs up in my office that I had to put on because I have to be appropriately dressed, of course, for replying to debates. But I'm very pleased to respond to this debate, and I congratulate the Honourable Member for West Dorset for securing it. I need to declare an interest early on as holders of the Calcutta Cup, of course, and favourites for the Six Nations, and I wish England all the very best of luck against France this weekend, so enable us to lift that trophy. But the honourable gentleman who moved the debate is absolutely right that rugby union, and indeed all sports, play a vital role in our national and local identity and across the country. And many of the things he says about the people who wash the kit, cook the food, coach the children, and all the people that are involved in our clubs as volunteers can be described across many sports across the country, and they are the beating heart of our communities. From the roar of Twickenham, or the silence sometimes of Twickenham, to the muddy pitches of our local leagues, it's a sport that instills the core values, of course, of teamwork, discipline and indeed respect. And these values are on show all the way from the grassroots rugby games all over the country, all the way to the Six Nations. And I'd like to celebrate Scotland and Wales' performances this weekend, of course, and hope that English finish strongly, as they probably should do. But beyond the game itself, rugby clubs serve as the beating heart of our communities, demonstrating how much rugby is so much more than just a sport. They are vital social hubs, as the Honourable Gentleman says, providing a sense of belonging, fostering local pride and delivering accessible opportunities for people of all ages to get active. And that's exactly why the Government has been unwavering in our support for the game, from the grassroots up to the elite level. Now, let me turn to the Government's support for grassroots rugby union, because that's been mentioned by the Honourable Gentleman in many of the interventions. The Government is committed to ensuring that everyone has access to and can benefit from quality sport and physical activity opportunities, including rugby union and indeed rugby league. And Mr Speaker would be upset if I didn't mention that, so I'll mention Rugby League too. Sport England has provided funding of over £16 million to the Rugby Football Union for the 22-29 period, supporting men's and women's grassroots rugby participation. And as well as this, we're also providing significant financial support to deliver grassroots sports facilities, including rugby. The Government recently announced £85 million to build and upgrade grassroots sports facilities across the UK in this year alone, including over £68 million, which will be invested in England via the Multi-Sports Grassroots Facilities Programme, and I hope that will resolve many of the issues that you've talked about in terms of facilities. This builds on over £80 million being invested in England in 25-26. 40% of funded projects through the Multi-Sports Grassroots Facilities Programme will have a multi-sport offer to allow more people to participate in a wider variety of sports such as rugby. Women's rugby, which has been mentioned in particular, has been exceptional growth in recent years, and women's sport, in fact, has such exceptional growth, but particularly in rugby. Since 2021, participation in the women's game has surged by 38%. It's great to see the growth of women's rugby, and it was fantastic to see the success of the Red Roses last summer, to inspire the next generation, of course, and that record 82,000 crowd, as well as a record television audience. In fact, a larger television audience than for the Six Nations watched that final. So this is part of the Government's work to drive a decade of change in women's sport, and my department is using the Women's Sport Task Force to drive progress across the sector and working with the authorities to do so. I'm happy to give way, yes.
Holly Davidson made history in February when she took charge of Ireland v Italy in Dublin in the Six Nations game, when she became the first woman to referee a men's game. Being a proud Scot, will he join me in congratulating her in this terrific move for women's participation in rugby generally?
It is a terrific success story, and I do congratulate her very much for doing so. And in fact, I think if there were more female referees in the men's game across all sports, it would probably be a much better behaved environment for people to be participating in. But it does give that inspiration. I have a 5-year-old and a 1-year-old, both girls, and when they get that inspiration of seeing the finals, they see the Lionesses or the Red Roses lifting those trophies, they see female referees participating in the game, that inspires them to do so much more, and that's why we should be celebrating all of these successes. But there's still the exception rather than the rule, and we need to make sure they are the rule rather than that exception. So the Government is committed to building on that huge success of the Women's Rugby World Cup to deliver a successful legacy programme with the RFU. We ensured there's a lasting legacy from the tournament by providing nearly £7 million to the World Cup legacy programme called Impact 25. I'm happy to give way, yes.
And I thank the member for West Dorset for securing this debate. In Keighley, we've got a real urgent challenge in that the last Conservative government allocated over £2 million to Keighley Cougars to build a new stand, but the money is still being withheld by Bradford Council and needs to be unlocked so we can get that stand built urgently. Would the Minister or his counterpart in MHCLG meet with me so we can discuss to try and get that money unlocked for Keighley Cougars?
Great. I'm happy to commit my colleagues to a meeting with the appropriate minister to do so. So let's do that, and let's at least write to the honourable gentleman and get that particular issue resolved. I was talking about the legacy programme. It has benefited 850 clubs, supporting women and girls of all ages to get involved in rugby, and that includes clubs based in the honourable gentleman's constituency of West Dorset, such as Dorchester RFC, who have received £5,000 towards upgrading their facilities. Mrs Vaz, if I could just use a couple of minutes in the time that we've got left to maybe run through some of the issues that were raised. Let's look at the financial stability of the game, which has been significant and concern since COVID in particular. My honourable friend, the Sports Minister, has met with the RFU and Prem Rugby previously to discuss the long-term financial sustainability of professional rugby union, and my officials regularly engage with the RFU and Prem Rugby on this issue. He was right to talk about the £158 million to rugby union to support the clubs during COVID-19, and the loan agents for that is Sport England. Sport England are always looking at analysing the repayments and the borrower's financial situation on that. We can't comment on individual clubs, but he did mention that the favourable terms, including long interest rates, long repayment periods and upfront payment holidays, and if there's any club who's struggling, they should get in touch with Sport England to have discussions with them on that with regards to the COVID loans in particular, with Sport England being the loan agent for them. He mentioned schools. It's good news for schools. The government is committed to protecting time for PE in schools, as set out in the government's response to the independent expert-led review of the curriculum. The new PE in school sport partnership that was announced by the Prime Minister last June will ensure that all children have equal access to high-quality PE, and these new partnerships will bring together schools, local clubs, national government bodies to target that funding and support where it is most needed, particularly in our state schools that are in most deprived areas, which was mentioned by one of my honourable friends. So I'm very happy to give way again.
On the point of PE in schools, will he, his counterparts in DFE now commit to publishing a national school sports strategy and a multi-year funding settlement, especially with the sports premium having been scrapped and other funds like the Opening Schools Facility Fund that has really benefited schools, particularly in disadvantaged areas? Minister Mark.
I've committed some of my colleagues to meetings and things already, but let me get the appropriate minister from DFE to write to the honourable lady to answer her particular questions. I'm coming on to her questions about planning and MHCLG in terms of Sports England. MHCLG are considering all the responses at the moment to the recent consultation and are continuing to discuss this with Sport England. No decision will be made until all those responses are analysed as part of the consultation, and MHCLG are taking that forward at this moment in time. And the final thing I just wanted to cover, Mrs Vaz, was the governance structures at the RFU, if I may just quickly run through that. Let's acknowledge the substantial change that's taking place within the governance of the RFU. I think they've heard the message, and the Prem's move towards a criteria-based expansion and demotion model. The government's consistently working with but monitoring the situation with the RFU, and representatives of the Prem and Champ clubs, including Premiership Women's Rugby, we're supporting them on the ongoing sustainability of the Elite Rugby Union. To conclude, Mrs Vaz, rugby union is a great national success story, some more than others, but it's a story currently writing its next critical chapter, and government are here to support that, both the women's game, the grassroots game and the elites game. The government has stood shoulder to shoulder with the sport through its most difficult moments like COVID, and will continue to champion its growth, particularly the growth of the women's game in particular. We look forward to seeing English rugby continue to thrive for generations to come. I have my fingers crossed at this particular dispatch box. Of course, Mrs Vaz, apart from when they play Scotland.
Thank you. The question is that this House has considered government support for English rugby. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. Order.